Good evening and welcome to the University of Wisconsin Division of Extension December 8th Beef Special Edition. My name is Sandy Stitchin and I am your facilitator this evening. Our presenters are Amanda Cauffman, Bill Halfman, Carolyn Eady, and Ryan Sterry. Our objectives for this evening are to increase awareness of the decision-making tools available at our University of Wisconsin Division of Extension Livestock website. And we want to do that by presenting them during a virtual meeting in order to increase the user's comfort level. Specifically, we're going to talk about the newest tools that determine forage needs and match the forage inventory to the animals, as well as increase the awareness of what it costs to raise heifers while accounting for all of the potential expenses occurred while raising them.
All right, thank you, Sandy. Again, my name is Ryan Sterry, and I'm the agriculture agent for St. Croix County up in the northwest corner of Wisconsin.
And I'm Amanda Cauffman, the egg educator in Grant County, Wisconsin. Tonight, Ryan and I are going to walk you through the replacement heifer closeout spreadsheet. Last year at the Driftless Beef Conference, Bill had presented our stocker closeout worksheet, and a member in attendance had suggested that it may be beneficial to put together a heifer closeout budget, much like the stocker closeout budget, to help producers better understand what it's costing them to develop their replacement heifers. Now, this is a closeout budget, and it's fairly important to understand that this is not going to help you make any predictions. What it is best used for is systematically evaluating what it costs a producer to raise a specific group of heifers. To better flow through this tool, we have come up with a little summary or scenario, since it is a closeout spreadsheet, to kind of walk through it. And our scenario is such. The group of heifers that we are analyzing were weaned in 2018 and would have calved in the spring of 2020. This is a seed stock operation that is 110 cows to calve in. The farm owns its own pasture, feed, and equipment, but what you will see is that we do allocate values for the pasture and the feed and the equipment. We put in these opportunity costs. And to just make sure that everybody's on the same page, an opportunity cost is the value that we could get for that feed or that pasture, whether it be renting it out or selling that feed, if we hadn't retained these replacement heifers. Going back to the scenario, this operation needs to calve in 15 heifers to maintain their herd size. There were 50 heifers that were weaned, and from these 50 heifers, we need to, this operation had to pick the top 15 that best fit their wants and needs. The heifers are weaned in early October and remain in the dry lot until they are AI'd. The heifers are synced to be AI'd the first week of July, and once the group is AI'd, they are put on pasture and ran with a bull for cleanup. So with that being said, that's kind of our scenario, and now we can move on to the actual tool to kind of run through how this works. So the first tab that we come to is the replacement heifer cost summary. And at the top, we can see where we are going to input the number of heifers weaned. Now remember, this is a seed stock operation, and they're going to operate a little bit differently than some of our commercial operations. So they are going to keep those 50 heifers until they can make the decision on which 15 they're going to keep. So of those 50 heifers, there's also an area to input the average weight and the market value of those heifers so that we can calculate an opportunity cost if you were to sell the whole group once they've been weaned and hopefully backgrounded. And that's going to give us a value per head. And scrolling down, we can see the number of heifers calving into your herd from this group is at 15, and the remaining 35 heifers we're going to sell, or the remaining 35 heifers we're going to sell prior to calving. If you are a commercial operation, obviously you're not going to have all those heifers for near as long. But maybe you have a heifer that didn't breed back or didn't breed. Maybe she had some other issues that you had to sell prior to calving. That heifer would go into that category. And then we have the total revenue of those heifers sold in the bottom cell. In scrolling down, as we said in our scenario, as we said in the scenario, those heifers were out on pasture with a bull for a period of time. So we have to include the number of acres that these heifers were on pasture and that value. So as we can see, those heifers were on 14 acres of pasture, and we assigned a $40 per acre value. Again, that's the opportunity cost. And scrolling down, we can see where the inputs from the other cells are eventually going to go. And we can also see that down here under the other livestock costs, there is two areas where we can input any interest, whether that be for the cattle, the feed, or a direct expense. So maybe we put up a new building and we have some interest that we have to pay for that, or that needs to be allocated to this group of heifers. There's also an area where we can input any bedding costs, as well as other supplies and a transportation cost. Maybe we have to move these heifers from one farm to another, or maybe the pasture that they're in is across town and we have to truck them back. That's where we're gonna put that expense. And scrolling down, there's also an area where we can input any yardage costs. Now, one thing to keep in mind is that we don't want to double count any expenses from our yardage costs in the other tabs throughout this spreadsheet. So any equipment used, maybe for scraping, yard, or any labor, we don't want to double count as we get going on throughout the spreadsheet. So I'm now going to toss it over to Ryan, and he's going to talk to you about the fencing and pasture cost tab.
All right, thanks, Amanda. So our next tab here covers fencing and pasture costs. So on our top lines here, this is customizable to your own operation, but in this particular case, we have seed, herbicide, fertilizer, lime listed. In this particular example, there is some spot treatment herbicide and fertilizer that got included in the costs. But if you had done some reseeding, liming, whatnot, you definitely should include those expenses here as well. So along with what the cost was, there's a column for years of useful life and then percent allocation to that group of heifers. So for example, if we had applied lime to this pasture, that has more than 1 year of useful life. You might want to spread that cost over 3-4 years, and that column allows you to do that. Also, if you're sharing pastures, if the heifers aren't out there the full time, you can also split that allocation to percent annual grazing season, that third blue column over. So that just lets you do some customization, but we definitely want you to think a little bit about what pasture expenses you might have, to be honest with yourself, and what this enterprise really costs you. If you want to scroll down just a little bit further, we get into fencing, and in this example, there was some barbed wire and T-posts that had to be replaced. And again, there's that years of useful life. So in this example, those costs are going to be spread across 7 years instead of incurring all that cost in 1 year, and also the same percent allocation. So one thing that we do want to highlight, and this is carryover from the Stalker budget that, or closeout that inspired this spreadsheet, is you do need to include some fencing pasture upkeep costs if this is going to be a sustainable enterprise. There's not a right or wrong number, but I know nobody likes going out there fencing and driving fence posts and that, but that is a very practical part if you're going to be doing this. So it is important just to think a little bit about what those costs might be. Make sure you include them in here. If we were doing this meeting face-to-face, we'd have some side conversations of, hey, do you include some fencing expenses in your annual budgets or not, or whatnot? A little tougher to do that that over Zoom, but that'd be just one thing I throw out there for you. You don't have to answer it. But think about that. Yeah, have you ever thought about just what do I really need to put into my fencing expenses? And if you look down just a little bit further, you can do the same thing with temporary fencing. So in this example, we didn't charge anything for that, but the poly wire or electric fence post would be an example of items to put down here. And then if we want to jump over one more tab, we get into the machinery and equipment. And this is going to be a lot of the same similar things where we want to look at years of useful life and percent allocation. Equipment, there's one extra step where we have to look at what's the current market value and what's the estimated ending value to try and help us get a little bit better estimate of what the annual depreciation expense is. And as Amanda pointed out earlier, we don't want to be double counting things. We want to account for everything. But if you're, say, your manure spreader scraping, those things that Amanda listed in her example are included in your daily yardage costs. Don't list your manure spreader and those things in the machinery as well. So one of the better, or not better, but one example that always helped me think this through, for thinking this is more as a stock or enterprise, just the pasture expense. I might have a gator that I got to use to go out and check heifers. I might have a tractor and mower that I have to go out there and use to clip weeds. That's not going to show up anyplace else. That would be very appropriate expenses to put here. The other thing that's not here, because we don't want to double count for it, is your round baler, haying equipment, those types of things. Amanda's going to cover that later. That's going to be included part of your feed costs. We're going to account for it there and not in this particular section. If you go down just a little bit further, if you did have a machinery lease, that could be included here. This particular farm doesn't. And also your annual upkeep expenses, your fuel, oil, utilities, and repairs would be accounted for here. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Amanda to talk a little bit more about feed costs. Oh, you're muted.
I'm sorry for that. So in the purchased and harvested feed tab, we can see what it costs to feed this group of heifers from weaning until calving into the cow herd. As you can see, we have two different winters to account for, because we're going to feed those heifers for 2 winters before they even have a calf. And as you can see, we have 2 different diets, and much like the forage tool that Carolyn and Bill had walked you through, we're going to account for any storage loss, and we have to put in the price per ton as fed. As we scroll down, we can also see where we can input any supplements or anything that they would have received out on pasture. And again, we have that storage loss and the price per ton as fed. And going back up a second, we also have a area where we can input the number of days that these heifers were fed in a dry lot. Now, that 420 is not a consecutive number of days. However, it's the total number of days that they would have spent not out on pasture. And as we scroll down, we can see where we can input the number of days where these heifers were on pasture. And scrolling down, this tab also has some really helpful price adjusters to get the dollars per ton on an as-fed basis. And the ones that we have available on this spreadsheet are the shelled corn, the eared corn price adjuster, and the hay and haylage price adjuster. And I'm going to pass it back to Ryan to talk to you about the AI and pharmaceutical tab.
Now I'm the one that didn't unmute. Thanks, Amanda. So yeah, we'll go through AI and pharmaceutical costs next. We're going to start off in the top section looking at AI expenses. Before we get too far into this, you might be saying, hey, I don't AI, I'm running a bull of these heifers. Amanda gets that tab next. So we are going to account for the bull expenses. They're just not going to be in this specific spot. So in this example, we're doing some of both. Heifers are getting first shot AI, and then they might be exposed to a bull later if they don't concede to first service or first or second service. So we have cedar, GnRH, Ludolase, and some AI expenses that we're going to include in that top section. If we go down a little bit further, this sheet is kind of nice because it lets you customize if you're doing some pharmaceutical treatments or veterinary work. You can enter them either as a group treatment or individual. So in this example, we're starting off with the group treatments, and this is going to be most of your vaccinations, preg checking, deworming, fly treatment, whatnot. That's included in this group treatment. All those heifers were getting it. One other thing I wanted to mention on this before I forget, I almost forgot. It's up to you how much detail you want to put into that section. If you want to work on this as you go, there's a request for this early on. You can enter in the date treatment they were treated, withdrawal times, double check yourself that you're following the proper withdrawal times. If you want to do this kind of as you go along with this group, if you're doing this after the fact, you don't have to enter that information. It still gets you the same results. Just make sure you enter what the treatment was and what the cost was. That's the important thing. And so if we go down just a little bit further into the individual treatments, this example had far fewer individual treatments. We had one heifer that was treated with Pro 300. That was probably a pink eye infection that we had to treat, but it was just one out of that group of 15, not all the heifers.
So then the next tab that we're going to jump to is the bull expense tab. And as Ryan said, we need to be able to account for any bull expenses that these heifers would have acquired. If they were exposed to a bull, they're going to have some type of bull expense. So as we can see at the top, we can put in a description of the bull, whether that be a name, a number, what have you. You can go ahead and put that in the description. The purchase price of that bull. Now, even if your bull is home raised, you're going to want to put a value in that box of what you could have potentially sold that bull for. We have the years intended, we intend to keep him, an expected called income. And these may be optimistic numbers, or maybe he sells for a lot more than that, but this is what you would expect. Okay. As we scroll down, we can see where we're going to input the related expenses for this bull. So the annual pasture expense not with cows. This bull was kept on a dry lot when he wasn't with cows. We can see where we can input any pharmaceuticals or breeding soundness exam, because we really should get our have our bulls breeding soundness exam before we kick them out with our cows, just kind of to make sure everything's on the up and up. And any other veterinary related expenses. Maybe he needed a little work done on his foot. As we scroll down, you can also see where we can input any bedding costs and any yardage costs, much like what we could for the heifers on the first tab. And scrolling down, we also have any feed that we may have had to feed him while he was in the dry lot. And again, that's a lot like the heifer tab of we have the shrinkage loss and the price per ton. And we also say how many days he was in that dry lot. We can also input any supplement that he may have received out on pasture when he wasn't with the heifers. As we scroll down, we can also see there's a cell where you can input the number of cows and heifers this bull was exposed to. As we can see, this bull was exposed to more than just that group of 15 heifers. If down in the chat box you would like to answer, would you please put what your average bull to heifer ratio is? A lot of times it does depend on the age of the bull, but we would just kind of like to see what your guys' responses are. And with that, I'm going to pass it back over to Ryan for the labor tab.
All right, we're getting close. So the labor tab is split into both paid and unpaid labor sections. So this top section is going to cover any paid labor expenses, and you can even further customize it if you want to look at labor versus management, difference with management being a little bit higher level work, a little bit higher wage, however you want to define that. And again, we don't want you to double count if you're counting some of this in your yardage costs, but there's labor expenses, so let's be honest with ourselves. So in this example, there's 1 hour a week, just kind of general labor around the farm, checking heifers on pasture, whatnot. that we're going to include in there at $10 an hour. If we go down below that, there's unpaid labor and management. So in this particular program, the unpaid labor and management isn't calculated into the final number, but we put it in here because we still think that's a very important number for you to know, figure out for yourself. Just as Amanda started off our talk with talking about opportunity costs, there's also an opportunity cost with your unpaid labor as well. There's other things you could be doing with your time if you really wanted to, if you weren't doing this. So again, it's not going to be reflected on that home tab there, but it might be useful for you just to think about this real quick, what kind of labor you're putting into the Heifer enterprise, just for your own knowledge. So with that, we've gotten through all the tabs, and it brings us back to this first tab we started with, and hopefully it makes a little more sense. There's a lot of yellow cells on there that were automatically calculated. Well, they're carrying over from these tabs that we just were showing you. So in the summary on this particular scenario, we go through our variable and fixed expenses, carry down the income from the sale of heifers that didn't calve on the farm, and we get this total net cost for raising replacement heifers. So in this scenario, that total cost came in around $26,500, or just over $1,760 per heifer that calved out. So full disclosure, we're showing you this particular Excel spreadsheet. It's featured on our topic hub. You're not going to hurt any of our feelings if you say, I don't want to use this particular spreadsheet. What we really want you to do is think about how to calculate this expense for your own farm, and also think about all the different variables that might go into this. We might have a few more friends if we told you pasture is free, it doesn't cost you anything, labor is free, it doesn't cost you anything. The bull on pasture is free, it doesn't cost you anything. And you might be like, oh, my numbers look great. You got to be honest with yourselves. So with that, I know Amanda had a few thoughts too on this summary. It doesn't tell you if that 1,700 is a good or bad number. That's up to you to figure out, is this where we need to be or not? So I'll turn it back to Amanda.
Exactly. So that 1,700 number allows us to know the value of our replacement heifers and help us to make better management decisions, such as, can we purchase those heifers cheaper? Or what is that value of us, being able to make those decisions for these replacement heifers, such as what they're fed, or maybe what bull they're bred to, or if they're going to be AI'd or serviced naturally by a bull. Kind of knowing what the value is of those heifers can better help us make some of them hard decisions with our replacement heifers leading into our cow herd. And with that, I'm going to pass it back to Sandy.
If anybody has any questions or concerns, go ahead and type in the chat so we make sure we hear from you. During the presentation, I had asked the question if anybody knew of resources for where to find the cost of pasture equipment, and Bill typed in a resource at Iowa State that is a few years old, but still has some useful information in it.
I believe also, if you look in the fencing closeout spreadsheet, we do have a link to that Iowa State fence publication. So it's one of the few that's out there that gives you some good ideas, and you might have to adjust the prices for little inflation or whatever, but it's a good resource.
One person is asking, what is our advice on bulls to cow ratios? So Amanda, you and Ryan covered it, so I'm going to let you answer that. What is your advice on the bull to cow ratio? And you have to remember to unmute yourself.
So it really is dependent on the bull's age. Up to a certain point, and I'm trying to remember it off the top of my head. So if anyone else remembers it, please go ahead and say it. But there's a certain number of cows we want that bull to have per month of his age, to a certain point. So like once he gets past a certain point, then he can handle a little closer to that 20 to 25. Also, if we AI the first round, that's also going to impact how many bulls that cow can cover.
Depends a little bit on pasture conditions. There's how much ground they have to cover each day. I don't remember the number off the top of my head either. That 1 to 25 is definitely in the range. Maybe for a yearling bull, that might be a little high. For a 2-3-year-old bull, that's definitely reasonable. Even 1 to 30 isn't uncommon. I did put a little tongue-in-cheek comment in there, the 1 to 9. So if you do a budget on that, it's not going to look as good as if you're doing 1 to 25. But if you don't have 25 cows, that's what you got. That's what you got to work with. And so you do have to keep that a little bit in perspective. And again, as Amanda mentioned, AI is tough in terms of labor and equipment. But in that example, uncle that has 9 cows, is he better off trying to look at AI instead? It depends. There's not a right or wrong answer to that, but that's one of those things that try to use to get you thinking a little bit about it. But definitely keep the bull's age in mind. I think Amanda made a comment earlier in the bull budget about trimming a bull's feet. There's no shame in doing that if that's what it takes for him to cover the herd that summer. Those are those bull upkeep things that you need to do. One of the good things about that bull expense tab, we got kind of excited putting that one together. Just looking at how much you have invested in that bull. Again, they're not free, so treat them like the investment that they are and give them the care that they need.
I had one comment in the chat that said I can't buy the type of replacements that I need, and I think maybe that comment is getting to the cost of raising that heifer. So again, you have to justify in your mind, is that $1,700 worth it? And for some people, I think the answer is yes, because the genetics and the care they put into that heifer. And then for other people, they're like, no, I can buy them for $1,000. So some of the chat comments I'm getting are to me privately, and there's a down arrow button on there. If you want to change that to everyone, you can do that on that drop-down window. I had a couple comments about sharing the links. Some people are putting some links in the chat, and we can share that out, all the chat links, in a follow-up email to you. In fact, that reminds me to tell you, watch for an email from me, because there's probably going to be at least one from this evening. Rest assured, we do not sell or give out your email list to anybody. So if I contact you, it's important, and I hope you open it and it doesn't go to your junk mail. Because on follow-up emails, also, you will be getting the links to this session, which has been recorded. So for those of you who joined late or needed to see it again, you'll be able to do that. Once you get the recorded, we have to get the recording finished and cleaned up and then get that link out to you. I guess I would be curious to ask, if you want to put this in the chat, is there any information, topics, speakers that you want us to cover at future sessions? It's always good to get some feedback from our audience to find out what it is that you want to hear about. So if you have speakers or topics that you want covered, go ahead and put them in the chat box.
One of the topics for future meetings is calling versus vitamin and mineral supplementing and cost-effective methods to bring your feeders to weight naturally. Well, good news as far as the vitamin and mineral supplementing topics. On January 12th, we will have Dr. Stephanie Hansen from Iowa State University talking to us about vitamin and mineral supplementing and requirements, not only for the cow-calf enterprise, but also for the feedlot. So tune in or join us that night for that information.
And I just put that on the screen share to remind you of that date, and also to add in that on this particular evening, there will be Beef Quality Assurance Continuing Education credits available for those of you who want to work on renewing your BQA. You can do that You can earn 1 CE credit by attending in person. You can't earn it by watching the recorded session later. You have to actually join with us. And again, anybody who needs to get a hold of any of us, here's our contact information. It's all at wisc.edu. You just got to know how to spell our names. Good luck with that. So are there any other comments in the chat? Because now that I'm sharing my screen, I can't see the chat.
So we have a one-stop shop for all of your winter webinar needs and information from Extension at UW. So all the webinars are free, and you're free to register for as many as you'd like and make sure that you get topics that you want. And I'm sure that you went to hear when you signed up for our session tonight, but more have been added as we go along. So if you run down the page, here are some more topics throughout the month of March, and I think some are scheduled into April. So we have some beef and dairy, farm management, small ruminant with sheep and goats topics.
So we meet again on January 12th, and then we are also participating in the Driftlifts Beef Conference, which is beginning on January 26th. You register for that on a separate location. And then we join back up with our Beef Special Editions in February. February 9th would be the next one then with Dr. Dan Thompson. And then our March is on March 9th, and that one I believe is with Dr. Dorfer for Harry Heelwort.
That's February 23rd.
February 23rd, see? Gotta let Carolyn do it.
That's okay. And then in March we have our pasture weed management, and then we'll be doing a co-hosting one with a small ruminant group where we'll be looking at direct marketing and some meat sweets from Cornell. And that will wrap up our winter series.
So again, thank you all for joining us this evening.
I'd just like to say feel free to reach out to us by email if you have questions for us at a later time, or would just like to communicate with us individually. We're open for you guys to do that. So just, if you forget our emails, just can search us at the Livestock Topic Hub underneath the People section. Thank you. Have a great night.